as we discussed last week in my review for both the original 1950s Blob and the 70s sequel, which is one of the most horrendous movies ever made, we're now going to talk about the 1988 remake. And this was actually a movie which I wanted to see for quite a long time, but I just didn't have the opportunity to. So I finally managed to pick up the DVD. I was really looking forward to it because the 50s original was one of my favourite horror movies even as a kid, and it's stayed with me ever since. This is a great remake, and it's one of those remakes which benefits very much from being in the 80s. It's much later than John Carpenter's The Thing in 88, whereas The Thing was in 82, but it's still from that same kind of era of much more graphic, gory effects, and it's the perfect kind of movie to benefit from that treatment. Because as I mentioned in my review of the original last week, that movie has a very fun and charming and campy way of carrying out its horror, but this one does a better job of showing, especially for its time, again in the 80s, the true horror of the Blob in a visual sense, because back in the 50s it would cut away, you'd get different camera angles showing shadows rather than actual deaths, all that kind of stuff that you'd assume a 50s movie would have, because they wouldn't go that far. It would be intimated, it would be assumed what had happened to someone. In the 80s, that didn't happen. You got to see it. In The Thing, in this one, in The Fly, various others, they show the gore, they show the sticky, icky mess of the bodies getting torn apart by these creatures, and they're all the better for it. It's why some of the most widely loved cult classic horror films come from that era. And this is one of them. Now, this movie doesn't get the same level of respect as, say, The Fly or The Blob, and although I love this, I will say that I can understand why that is the case. Because I love this movie, but at the same time, I have to admit, it's not quite as well made or as well executed as The Blob and The Fly. Because, as I've mentioned a number of times on this channel, The Thing is my favourite movie of all time. It's, as far as I'm concerned, a perfect movie, but very subjectively so for me. The Fly is a movie which I got around to seeing much more recently, and I absolutely adored it. I've still only seen it once, on the release of this video at least, and it made me tear up. And I love that, because movies which are designed to make you tear up, in a conventional sense, with sappy music and relationships, that doesn't work. Movies which have more of a tragedy to them, or a tragic horror, you know, stuff like older horror movies would have, like Vincent Price in House of Wax, that kind of tragic backstory or tragic events. That is what movies like The Fly had. With The Blob, they're not really going for that. It's not trying to be tragic, but at the same time, it's not going completely all out in the way that The Thing does, because the casting in The Blob isn't as strong. The effects, although great, aren't as often, because in The Thing you get so many opportunities to see the practical effects, whereas in The Blob they're a little bit fewer and far between. They're not rare, because there are enough of them to keep you satiated, certainly more than the original 50s film, but not as many as The Thing, and they're not as intense for the most part as, say, The Fly. Because with The Fly, of course, it's more with the progression of the film that you get more of that. With this movie, you get it basically as soon as the Blob shows up. And although I didn't make a note of all of the scenes which happen and show up where you get to see the Blob kill someone, there were definitely 3 in particular which stood out. And these aren't spoilers, they're very vague, but anyone who's seen this movie will know exactly what I mean. 1 is the sink, 2 is the phone booth, and 3 is... I can't recall where it was, but I believe it's a hospital, somewhere like that, where you get that iconic scene of the Blob, which is pretty much the front cover of the box, where you see full Blob attack with the arm, let's put it that way. Those 3 scenes are fantastic. You get to see the full visual horror of the Blob, the kind of distortive, crazy, bone-crunching, skin-melting, or deconstituting, not melting, that the Blob can do. And as I mentioned in my review of the original, this is a movie which, instead of letting you think for yourself about the horror of the creature, it gives you a little helping hand. It gives you a little bit of a nudge and shows the horror a lot more. and I love it for that. This is definitely a very, very 80s horror film. Not necessarily to the same quality par, or the same acting par as The Fly or The Thing, as I said earlier, but still very good. And most definitely a very, very big cut above most modern horror films, as far as the characters go, and the effects go, and the storytelling goes. Now, speaking of that story, and the plot, and the concept, it is a remake, not a sequel, thankfully. That 70s one was horrendous, so you kind of know what's going to happen as an essential concept if you've seen the 50s movie. If you haven't, if you're watching this one before the 50s film, then you'll go into it obviously with less knowledge, but the essential concept of the creature is pretty much what you'd expect. This blob, essentially a sentient stomach, which dissolves people and eats them. Everything else is incidental, because you put that creature into any circumstance, you're going to have a good B-movie. You could put that into Jaws, and it'll eat the shark. You could put it into Deliverance, and that'll be a considerably different movie. You can put it into a number of different scenarios, and the Blob is just this interchangeable character, which makes any movie 100% more camp, but 100% more fun, because of how crazy a concept it is. And one of the things that's great about the Blob is it's simultaneously very funny to look at, but also very intimidating in the way it works, the way it moves, and this emotionless, faceless, characterless way that it kills. In a similar way actually to Splinter from 2008. And I would say that the Blob is actually much more similar to Splinter than it is to John Carpenter's The Thing. Because people always put the Blob up against The Thing, because they're both from the 80s, they both have the practical effects, they both have the crazy visuals, and that's understandable. They are both biological life forms that attack larger life forms. But when you really consider the way that the Blob acts, reacts, the intelligence that it shows or doesn't show, it's much more similar to Splinter than it is to The Thing. That raw, animalistic, base level, almost like a super oversized single cell organism, where it just acts in a totally instinctual way with no real discernible intelligence behind it. It has some show of intelligence when it needs to, but most of the time it just basically attacks the nearest warm body, in effect. And that's much more similar to Splinter than it is to The Thing. The Thing has an agenda, and it knows how to get it done. The Blob doesn't really have an agenda, it's just an eating machine, and the Splinter creature isn't an eating machine, but it's similar to that because it's a fungus, in effect, and it just infects whatever it can. So, similar to the Blob. Now, as far as the packaging of the movie, the way it was made, that is what I think makes the Blob seem to be a little bit cheaper than The Fly and The Thing, and some others, because the characters are good, but the acting is a little bit, well, it's hard to describe. It's not bad, but it's acted by young people for the most part who very much so know that they are acting, if you know what I mean. Not TV movie level, there are actually a lot of famous faces in this movie, but still, they're young actors, they're clearly inexperienced, and that can kind of take you out of the moment some of the time. Plus, I think one of the things that would have been done a little bit better in this movie had the visuals been different is that in the original 50s The Blob, the settings where the creature is and the town where the people are is very basic. It's extremely visually basic. And the brilliant payoff to doing that is it allows the focus of attention, both in terms of camera work and story, to be on the creature. Because with the Blob, you don't have the benefit of having crazy teeth and flailing arms like the Thing does, or to have deformed body parts and splinters sticking out like Splinter does. The Blob is just a blob, so you have to really focus the attention on the creature, otherwise it will easily be overshadowed by the scenery. And that is the case in the original, and it works, because it's the 50s, that kind of cardboard cowboy town look, which the town has. In the 80s, though, that doesn't really work, and that's a little bit of a drawback for me with this movie, because a lot of the sets and the scenes look a little bit too fake. They don't look like real places, and for me that's one of the main things, if not the main thing, that actually makes this feel a little bit less polished than either The Thing or The Fly. In its own way, it's certainly not bad though. I don't want to give that impression. I love this movie. It is a horror classic for sure, a creature feature classic, a monster movie classic, certainly. But don't expect it to be as good as the other two in particular, which I mentioned, or even some older ones. So overall, that brings us to our individual scores. So first of all, of course, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and the plot of 1988's Blob, I'm going to give it a little bit of a bump up from the original with a 6, because it makes the story, which is essentially the same concept of course, a little bit more complex in terms of outside involvement in the town, various characters who act differently, so it keeps it fresh. You don't want it to be a shot-for-shot remake, of course, so it does keep it fresh, it brings in new ideas, new characters, and it is carried out pretty well, I would say. Far better than the 70s version, and I would say a little bit better than the 50s one, but in different ways. It's not better in a strict sense, but you know what I mean. It's updated for the time, and it benefits from that. As far as the characters, the casting, the choices that they make, well actually just like the original, I'm going to give it another 7, because by far the strongest character in the 50s one, in terms of likability and just being that character who you naturally follow and want to survive, is easily McQueen. Of course it is, he's the most iconic character from that original movie. Whereas in this one, it's more about an ensemble. And it benefits from that, because it means that no one actor or actress has to bear the weight and the load of being the main character. Because this I can say for certain, none of the main characters in this movie could carry that burden by themselves. In the original, McQueen could do that. In The Thing, Kurt Russell can do that, even though it is very much so an ensemble, he is the focal point. In Splinter, you've got that split up between a few characters, 3 in particular. In this movie, it's very good that that leading role, although focusing on certain people, is people rather than a person, and it definitely benefits from that. It helps also to make the overall quality of the acting seem better than if it was just one main person, because then you'd see more of the flaws and things which they weren't doing quite as well. As far as the visuals, the effects, of course, the effects in a movie like this, well, I'm going to score it pretty high, a 9, because although I mentioned earlier on that the town itself suffers from the same kind of cardboard cutout look that the original had, which may well be an homage to the original, I can't say for sure, the visuals of the Blob are superb. Some of the best practical effects, certainly not as appreciated as they should be, certainly not even close in fact. But they are excellent. They're really well carried out, they're gory, they're gruesome, you can't take your eyes off of it, and the creature looks good, it looks convincing. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, I'm going to give it a 6, which is a little bit lower actually than I gave to the original, because with the original it had that very over-the-top music and also the great theme tune, whereas with this one, it's a little more conventional. It's not bad, but it's a little more conventional. But at the end of the day, a 6 out of 10 is still not a bad score. That is above par, so that's nothing to be ashamed of. And finally, of course, for the rewatchability and entertainment factor, well, once again, I'm going to give this one a slight edge over the original with an 8 out of 10, which is a pretty good score for rewatchability, because with the original, it definitely has rewatchability, certainly, both on your own and in a group, but this one I would say easily has that little bit more, because the effects give you what you want from a group horror movie watch. At the same time, the characters, the dialogue, the story concept itself doesn't exactly require that you pay 100% attention. It's very much so a B-movie, and it knows that. It embraces that, and it runs with it. You could take the concept of the Blob and make it much more serious and potentially much scarier, but the movie deliberately doesn't do that. It keeps that little bit of camp in there, that little bit of cheesiness, but also gives you that great, imposing, intimidating, gory monster, and that works well. So overall, I'm giving the 1988 remake of the Blob a very decent, and higher than the original, 3.6 out of 5. I would definitely recommend checking this one out, but also, if you haven't already, you should see the 50s one. Don't see the 70s one though, that's horrendous, as I discussed in that first review. So overall, I'm a huge fan of the Blob as a creature and as a franchise, even despite the horrendous 70s sequel. And personally, I wish that people talked about it more. I wish it came up in discussions and top 10s more. I know that a lot of people won't consider it as highly as I do. It's just one of those movies. It's very much so a B movie, and unlike things like The Thing, it didn't really attempt to go any higher than that. But that's not necessarily a bad thing for the Blob. It knows what it is, and it runs with it. So yeah, definitely check it out, and of course I'll see you guys next week with another review. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.